Hello and thanks for joining me for this presentation on the subject of building SharePoint 2010 solutions with Visual Studio 2010. This is a re-recording of a presentation that was delivered to the Perth SharePoint user group on the 20th of May 2010. A little bit about me. I'm a senior technical consultant with a firm called Diversis, locally based in Perth, Western Australia. I currently work primarily as the development coordinator or tech lead for a government agency by the name of Tourism Western Australia. Over there, I'm one of the guys responsible for one of many sites, which includes westernaustralia.com. w.com is one of the top-ranked SharePoint sites on various SharePoint ranking sites, and I know it's used quite frequently as it's been around for quite a while on running on SharePoint, and it's used quite frequently as an example of what can be achieved with SharePoint for internet-facing sites. Finally, I'm also the author of the Dirty Words blog at blog.mediahold.com. And if you found this video somewhere online and want the slide deck with the links at the end, please visit the blog. So tonight I'm going to be talking quite a bit about solution development and exploring some of the interface features in Visual Studio 2010 around packaging and features. We'll take a look at visual web parts and make some observations there. We'll have a quick look at the F5 debugging features that are been provided to us with 2010. We'll take a cursory look at link to SharePoint. Just enough to get you started, basically, and then we'll have a quick look at some console app considerations as well. So I guess before we look at the 2010 stuff, it's worth considering and reflecting a little bit on where we've been for the last couple of years with MOS 2007 development. Essentially, it's not been a very happy story. Microsoft unleashed SharePoint 2010 into the wild, of course, without a lot of documentation. And without a lot of the necessary tooling to produce the solution files and deploy the custom code in a repeatable, sensible manner. So essentially, as SharePoint developers, we were really lacking in the area of tool support, especially officially sanctioned tool support from Microsoft. Of course, the SharePoint community, being what it is, stepped in to fill many of those gaps with tools like WispBuilder, STSDev, SharePoint Manager 2007, and these tools, especially the likes of SharePoint Manager, are going to continue to be relevant to us going forward with 2010. But the reality, I guess, is that these are community-built, third-party, unsupported tools. Conceivably, and a lot of the sort of workflows that were built into these tools differ in some ways from what Visual Studio is now providing us. So it's worth bearing in mind, I guess. Unlike our ASP.NET developer friends, we had to have knowledge of not only the .NET framework but the product itself, and in many ways that meant knowing all about the 12.5 and its internal structures. Of course, this is in some ways a good thing, but it's also a bit of a danger area, because it is the 12.5 and the SharePoint root now in SharePoint 2010 represents much of the inner workings of SharePoint itself. Of course, we needed to know enough about Camel to get by, and we had to understand what DDF files were all about, how to produce solutions using them with the likes of MakeCab, conceivably throw in some Visual Basic scripting and batch files and all that to get a cab file or a Wisp file at the other end. And then within that, we needed to know about manifest files, elements files, and a whole ton of XML files, just to get stuff deployed in a sane manner into SharePoint. All this, of course, leads to a very steep learning curve, especially again for those of us who started working as ASP.NET developers coming to a SharePoint shop. It's pretty much night and day, and isn't always the most fun and rewarding experience. of course, all of this leads to a drop in productivity. And in many ways, that's productivity loss that could have been saved or gained by the provisioning of adequate developer tools by Microsoft in the first place. My personal opinion is that Microsoft really really dropped the ball with SharePoint 2007 development and the whole development story. But to give them their due, they sort of redeem themselves with Visual Studio 2010, and I'll show you some of the goodies tonight. But essentially, back in the day, all of these negatives led to overheads for us as developers trying to get stuff delivered on time, in budget, and also led to overhead for the businesses who were working for and who were building code for, and who have made a significant investment in SharePoint itself and all of the related technologies. So in my mind, working with SharePoint 2007 was in many ways comparable to working in Notepad to develop HTML pages back in 1995. As an ASP.NET developer, it in many ways felt like a step backwards, and that's not always a good thing, of course. So if you're Homer Simpson, you had a tough go of it, really. So normally in my presentations for the user group in SharePoint Saturday, I tend to tell it as it is. And with 2007, there was a lot of telling to be told. Essentially, in this presentation, I'm not going to be doing a lot of SharePoint bashing beyond what I've already done. And I'm certainly not going to be doing any Visual Studio bashing. I've always been a big fan of Visual Studio, and VS 2010 is a fabulous tool, and in terms of what it's doing for SharePoint development, what it's going to be doing for SharePoint development, basically 5 stars all around. The short of it is, Visual Studio is now considered a first-class citizen. Or SharePoint is now considered a first-class citizen within Visual Studio, and it shows. They've put a lot of thought into this. And I guess as someone who used to hand cut my DDF files and XML and manifest.xml files, I never really envisioned a point where I'd be able to go from that to a fully integrated development environment for this sort of thing. And I'm really pleased to say that the transition has been obvious to me, and working in Visual Studio 2010 is pretty much the way that I'd expect to work. It seems logical to me. And I'm basically very happy with everything I'm seeing so far. So in terms of goodies to look out for, which we'll be looking at tonight in detail, are essentially this list here. So everything about the abstraction of solution file and feature development, especially around the areas of automated manifest and feature.xml file generation and management. We've basically got some great tooling in place for this stuff now that was completely lacking before, and they've taken it sort of beyond just that. We'll see how our projects are now automatically signed for us, and the bits that rely on those keys are now sort of managed for us as well. Out of the box, we get a number of SharePoint project template and a number of SharePoint item templates as well. We get visual designers for, as I said, a lot of the solution building bits, the feature building bits, and of course the visual web part as well. SharePoint Explorer is new to the Server Explorer sidebar. We'll have a look at that. Visual Studio 2010, of course, introduces the extensibility framework, MEF, which allows us to extend Visual Studio itself as required, or easily install extensions produced by our peers in the community and third parties. The SharePoint root folder is abstracted away. It's still there, of course, but in terms of working with it, it's much easier. And debugging is pretty much a much better story than it's been previously. So a few things not to like, I guess. As I've said, this is in my mind, this is a version 1 release of the SharePoint integration components within Visual Studio, and they've done a hell of a lot. It's not like they haven't had enough time, but What we've got is good, but with a lot of the SharePoint object model stuff, I was really hoping to be able to develop Visual Studio's SharePoint solutions without the need for a local SharePoint install. And unfortunately, we do have to install Visual Studio on our dev VMs, and this just completely grosses me out, install SharePoint itself on our Windows 7 or Vista workstations, which is supported now, but personally it's not something I'd ever want to do. I'd essentially do all of my building on my workstation in Visual Studio, and try to keep my dev VM as clean as possible so that I don't have to face any deployment issues when the solutions that I'm building hit test and production. And to do that, and this just comes from being an old school developer, I don't like installing Visual Studio and all of its associated toolset onto my server. Other things, I guess, the days of Visual Studio development for SharePoint 2010 are young, and I'm sure that there are going to be complexities and issues that aren't addressed by the tooling. And I think, as I said, the community is going to address a lot of those over time, and hopefully some of those things will be integrated into the product itself. But I guess the next release, got really high hopes for that one, put it that way. So the rest of the presentations tonight is going to be all demo-based. And to kick off, the first demo that I'll be looking at tonight is the first couple of demos actually around constructing an empty SharePoint project. We'll be having just mainly exploring the interface, especially around the areas of packaging and features and map folders. So let's get into it. Alright, for the next couple of demos I'm working within the Beta 2 VHD provided by Microsoft. We've reached the RTM milestone now, of course, but I don't believe there's an RTM VM that's been released just yet, so this one's quick and easy for me, and allows me to blow it away when I screw it up. So what we're looking at essentially is Visual Studio 2010. Apart from that, on this VM we've also got SharePoint, of course, installed, and within that there's a website called internet.contoso.com, which we'll be targeting tonight for our deployment effort. So Visual Studio 2010 itself doesn't change much. No ribbon, unfortunately, of course, but everything else looks more or less the same apart from the color scheme. So what I'm going to do next is go ahead and create a new project. This bit's pretty easy. So essentially I'm looking at the SharePoint node within the installed templates section of the new project screen, and nothing new for 2007, unfortunately, but for 2010 we've got a really usable number of project templates. We'll look at some of these in detail a little bit later. What I'm interested in the moment is an empty SharePoint project. It's worth noting that the concept of anything empty in SharePoint 2007 was a bit of a misnomer. For those of you who have been through the whole minimal .master experience and built that sort of thing on your own, you'll understand what I mean, of course. And what you get with the empty SharePoint project is everything that you need to start building a SharePoint project from the ground up. So there are a few bits that Visual Studio provides out of the box, but you don't even get sort of the default.aspx page that you get with that you used to get with an ASPX project. So some niceties on that front. It's also worth noting that we need to target the version 5 of the .NET 3.5 of the .NET framework. Outlook SharePoint 2010, sorry, does not support version 4.0 just yet, so we're going to have to stick with 3.5 for the time being. So I'm just going to name my project empty project and hit OK. So the next option I need to decide on is which site I want to use for debugging. I'm going to stick with the default in this case, which is the internet site I mentioned, and that needs to be a local site. So it's worth noting that Visual Studio is running on the same machine as SharePoint itself, and I can't actually be doing any of this stuff if that weren't the case. Second decision I need to make is whether I want to create a sandbox solution or a farm solution. Essentially, I'm building trusted code and some code that needs to be running in a farm solution, basically. So that's the option I'm going to go with tonight. So here's our empty solution, just as requested. It's pretty basic, as you see. There's a couple of things that look a little bit new, such as this feature and package node, which we'll look at in a second. And the key, the key file that we would have previously had to generate manually. So that's been created for us automatically. And if we have a look at the properties page and the signing tab, we can see that the project is already configured to use that key as well. So a little nicety. We'll see a little bit later on how the key file, the public key token, and the whole sort of four-part strong name bit is actually being managed for us as well by Visual Studio, which is a big win. So if we have a look at the project sheet, basically what I'm going to do is just a quick exploration of some of the interface bits here that we need to be aware of around the packaging area and the features area. A lot of these things would have been included, wrapped up in the XML files and the DDF files that we're used to working with. So that's no longer the case. Those files are there, except for the DDF file. Some of the other bits are sort of strewn around a little bit. They're fairly intuitive, but they are sort of mixed up in a few different places. So let's have a look at that next. So the first thing to note is that the site URL is configurable. So this is really handy if you get if one of your peers in your shop or conceivably another integrator sends you a solution file that you need to now open and start developing with. You can change the URL to target your own environment. I haven't quite figured out how this is going to work. If this file, for instance, is coming out of TFS or your source control system, and you don't really want to be going in here and reconfiguring this every bloody time you start up, every time you start working in the morning after you've done get latest, and you've got your neighbor's dev machine or something. So I'll have to see what happens there. I can also change my option to run as to package a sandbox solution or farm solution, and then things start to get a little bit more interesting. I have the option of including the assembly that's going to be generated for me by this as the output of this project in the SharePoint package. Why wouldn't I want to include the assembly? Well, perhaps I'm deploying only page layouts in my feature, or some sort of static content that doesn't rely on custom code. In that case, I might want to set that false. The assembly deployment targets an interesting one in the way that it defaults to the global assembly cache. Everything I've always been taught is that you generally want to avoid the GAC because of the security ramifications. So of course, any code running the GAC is running in full trust, and preferably you want your code, you want a custom defined code access security that's granting only the permissions to your code that it needs to run. Interesting that it's defaulting to the GAC, and perhaps related in some ways to a change and a shift in direction around the recommendation in that area. I was reading a white paper from Microsoft the other day on the sizing of SharePoint environments and scalability, that sort of thing, and it was it essentially made the recommendation that you want to prefer the GAC because the overheads in terms of the security checks are fewer than if you're running in the private bin directory. Of course, debugging in the GAC's traditionally been a little bit more painful. A lot of that goes away now, of course, but there are other considerations as well. And then, of course, up here we have the active deployment configuration, which we'll look at it in a little bit more detail on the properties page itself. So let's do that next. Let's drop into the SharePoint tab on the project. properties page. And I guess the first thing to notice before we get back to the configuration side of things is the option to specify a pre- and post-deployment command line calls that we want to make. So for instance, to some sort of file that needs to do something either before or after deployment. This differs of course from the pre- and post-build events. They're still available and you can still make use of them if you want to. But this is the pre- and post deployment of your SharePoint solution within SharePoint itself. Coming down here to the configuration bits, this is definitely a new concept to Visual Studio, of course, and it's providing, if we have a look at it, providing effectively a designer for the deployment steps that you want to be taking in your dev environment. It's worth noting that you don't probably want to go too overboard on this, because at the end of the day you're producing a CAB file or a WISP file that you're going to hand off to your system administrator, and that individual is still going to require some sort of script to deploy the stuff into production environment. So it's not like this is going to be packaged up for you in some sort of deployment script that you can hand off along with your CAB file. That would have been nice, but it's not the way it works. So essentially, previously a lot of us would have used batch files or perhaps some PowerShell stuff to retract the solution if necessary, add it back to the solution store, deploy it, activate any features, and then of course run our pre- and post-deployment commands if required, and do things like resetting the application pool or IIS as a whole. So this is just a little bit of a sort of friendlier way to manage that as a developer. You can shift these things in and out as you require. So perhaps you don't want to activate all the features in the solution. And that's exactly what this no activation configuration gives you. In essence, my understanding is that with the default configuration you're activating all of the features within the solution, and it's not always what you want to be doing. Waldek's got a nice little blog post on some of the issues with this, and he's actually posted an extension to Visual Studio that's available in the Visual Studio gallery, and will supposedly also be part of the community kit for SharePoint developer extensions, I think it's called. I've got a link at the end of the slide deck, which allows you to selectively activate just the features that you want as part of a custom configuration. And despite the presence of these two configurations, you can create your own configurations from scratch as well. You can actually edit either of these two out-of-the-box versions. In the RTM release, there's another box down here which allows you to auto-retract after debugging. Effectively what this does is once you finished up debugging, if the box is checked, Visual Studio will go ahead and while you return to work on the code, Visual Studio will work behind the scenes to retract the solution and do things like recycle the app pool and then ping the app pool so that it's up to speed when you next hit F5 and keep debugging. So I'm not sure if that's working, if that happens by default. In this case, I don't think it does in the beta, but it doesn't matter anyway. So if we close this up, and next up, let's have a look at the package node in here. So essentially, as I mentioned, this package is now abstracting the couple of files that we used to have to deal with previously, notably the DDF document directive file and manifest.xml. Manifest.xml still exists behind the scenes, but I've yet to come across a DDF file, and I'm grateful for that. So that obviously Visual Studio is taking care of all that stuff behind the scenes for us in some manner. So the package itself is essentially we get one package per project, so you can't actually go in here and add additional packages. There's just wait for that to come up. There isn't. If you right click on the package, you don't get an option to add additional packages for this project. So if you want to do that, I suppose you'd create a second SharePoint project, and that's pretty much in keeping with the way that that we used to structure these things manually for SharePoint 2007 development. So there's nothing too surprising on that front. What is surprising, of course, is the designer that we get for designing our packages, for configuring what's included in the package from the solution itself. So we'll see that in action in a second when we actually add some content to this project. But I guess it's worth noting as well that if you're deploying stuff into a SharePoint environment, the best practice way to be doing that is via solution packages, and that's why this designer is great. It's because you really sort of there used to be, as mentioned, a lot of overhead to creating these things manually, and with things like designers, the tooling really sort of helps out a lot here to sort of remove any excuses for not making use of packages. And this stuff is so easy. You're going to I'm basically going to just sort of put together a basic project here tonight and deploy it, and it's really just so easy. It's such a walk in the park by comparison. And of course, any of the stuff that you're deploying via packages are repeatable across the environment and managed by SharePoint itself. So you have a guarantee in some ways that the stuff you're deploying is going to conceivably be in a healthier state than it was if you were just dragging and dropping stuff into the SharePoint root. So of course, we can name the package if we like. By default, it's going to use the name of the project and modify that. And then there's a couple other things that will probably look familiar to you if you're used to SharePoint 2007 development and the manifest.xml file. For instance, the option to reset the web server on deployment. The solution ID can be changed down here in the property sheet as well if need be. You can configure the deployment type. So, for instance, if you're targeting a web front end or the web front ends or an application server, you can specify the description, of course, and specify the receiver assembly and class if necessary as well. I don't think there's an option to add that from any of this stuff for the context menus. There isn't. And the reset web server commands repeated here as well. Down below, we're in design mode at the moment. Down below we've also got the advanced tab. So if we had some, let's say, some third-party assemblies that we don't want to deploy alongside our solution, or an assembly for another project that was part of this Visual Studio solution, we could do so using this dialog. Essentially locate the DLL file, tell it where it needs to go, configure the safe controls as necessary, and you're golden. Essentially that's going to end up in your manifest file just like it used to. Speaking of which, we still have a manifest file, and that's illustrated for us in this through the manifest tab here. Up the top here we have a preview of that file. So this is basically what Visual Studio is generating for us, and we can edit it as we see fit as well. So there's a note up here that any content will be merged with the XML file generated by, and we can't see the rest of it, but by Visual Studio as well. So it's interesting to note that if we start putting stuff in here that isn't recognized as a valid, that won't validate against the relevant schema, you can see that Visual Studio is going to tell us just that, and it's going to fail in parsing the XML file, and alert us to the fact that we've done something wrong. So that's really handy, and just one of those great areas where strong tool support really shines. Over on the left-hand side here we have the Package Explorer. The Packaging Explorer, it's empty at the moment, of course, as well, but this is basically a hierarchical view of our package, and we'll see how this is going to come in handy when we're looking at features in a second. And finally, on this front, we have a couple of contextual commands available to us from the project menu itself to, of course, build the project like we used to, deploy it. Package it, of course, deploy it, and retract it directly to SharePoint. So that's pretty handy. So next up, let's have a look at our features node. Unlike the package node, the features node is a container folder for one or more features. If I go ahead, I can, of course, create a feature to then populate with SharePoint project items, or SPIs as they're called, basically any of the bits that we want to deploy into SharePoint. But what I'm going to do instead, just to illustrate how convenient the tooling is on this side of things, is add a new web part. And what that's going to do for me is, notice that I don't have an existing feature. It's going to go ahead and I'm just going to add a dummy visual web part that doesn't do anything. So Visual Studio has noticed that I don't have an existing feature to deploy this web part. So what it's going to do for me is create one, and it's called it Feature 1, not surprisingly. So I'll just minimize this visual web part stuff. We're going to come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. And bear with me while my VM catches up. Apologies. Just while we're waiting for this, one thing I forgot to mention as well, you can't see it of course here, is that when I created my new empty project, Visual Studio actually added a reference to Microsoft.SharePoint for me. And if you're working with other references, there's the community, again, the what was it called? The community kit for SharePoint development extensions adds a tab up here for SharePoint specific DLL, so you don't need to sort of go digging through the .NET tab. It's improved with Visual Studio 2010, of course, a fair bit in terms of the way it loads, but it's still a bit of a pain in the bum in terms of the way it loads over time. And you have to eventually sort these things by name to find stuff, and it just gets a bit tedious. So that extra tab I don't have installed here, but will likely come in handy if you're working with more than just Microsoft.SharePoint. So I'll just collapse some of this stuff and get rid of my package. And so let's have a look at this Feature 1 and see exactly what's going on here. So I guess first thing to notice is that it looks quite similar to our package designer, and essentially it is very similar to our package designer. If we go back here to our package, we can now see that our feature and its various project items are now being deployed as part of this package, which is all good, of course. If we don't want it in there, we can get rid of it or add it back. Nothing too thrilling there. And our feature is a sort of lower view of the same bits, but of course it's feature specific. So if we have a look at some of the interface bits here, we can change the title, of course. We can change the scope that we're deploying to. It's worth noting that because I've chosen to create a visual web part when I added that project item, the scope's been set for me as site. By default, if I can just add a second feature here, Feature 2, brilliant name. We'll see that the default that Visual Studio selected for me is to deploy to web, to the website. So, because in the Feature 1 case, our Visual Studio actually has added the visual web part for me. It knows that a visual web part requires a feature scope of site, so it's changed that for me automatically, which is nice. So again, over on the property sheet for the feature itself, there's quite a number of properties that will look familiar to you if you're used to cutting these by hand. Of course, we can change the feature ID if necessary. If there's any sort of clash there, that's unlikely, of course. We can activate it automatically, force install it if we need to, install it in central admin if we like. We can see exactly where it's going. Basically, it's going into the features directory in the Hive, within a folder named after our project. We can specify the URL for the feature so that it will appear as an icon basically in central admin. We can specify the feature assembly and class for features receiver. Notably, you can also configure these through the context menu, which I won't be looking at tonight. You can configure whether the feature itself is hidden or visible within SharePoint. You can change the assembly of feature receiver class and assembly if need be. Change the scope down here as well, and set some upgrade bits as well, which are new within 2010. Over here in the designer, of course, we're looking at the design mode. If you have any feature dependencies that you need to tie in, you can do so by specifying the features within the solution, or based on ID outside of the solution. And in the same way as we have the manifest file for the package, we also have the manifest file for our feature. And again, it's editable, and it's the XML file that comes at the other end, basically. I mentioned the Packaging Explorer earlier, and the hierarchical view that it gives us. Unlike the design view, which is, I guess, more about the top-level contents, the Packaging Explorer comes in handy when things get a little bit, if things get a little bit mixed up, and especially as your project grows in size. It's just an alternate view that might come in handy, basically. So finally, if we have a look at the Add menu, we've got the option to add map folders to the SharePoint root. And basically these folders, if I add, I'll go ahead and add a layouts folder. This folder is, as I can see, mapped to the template/layout folder, layouts folder in the 12 hive. So if I have a look at, the 14, the SharePoint root, which is of course where I want to be deploying any custom page layouts. So of course you can see all of the SharePoint stuff that's provided out of the box. So a best practice has traditionally been to create a subfolder within there, within that directory, named after the project that you're working on, or the feature, whatever. And Visual Studio's automated that for us. So it's created a folder called empty project, named after with the name taken from the project itself. And anything that I add to there should be added to that folder. And then when this stuff gets deployed, we'll have a new folder called empty project, and all of the contents deployed in a safe manner. So if someone else comes along and wants to install their own package, we're not going to have any conflicts if SharePoint itself is upgraded with a service pack, and in some way introduces a folder that conflicts with our own naming. We won't have any issues. Pages that conflict with our own naming, we won't have any issues there. It's just a question of isolation, really. So the same goes for the images folder. That's also available as a little shortcut link there. And then basically all of the other folders in the root are also available to add in here as well. And that concludes this demo. Next up, next couple demos, we'll be looking at the F5 debug experience, link to SQL, and a little tiny bit about console applications. In this next demo, I'm going to be looking at the visual web part, debugging, link to SQL, and spend a few seconds on some considerations for developing console applications that target SharePoint. So continuing on from where we left off with our empty project, I've already added a visual web part here, so let's start with walk through some of the bits involved there. In the past, when we created a web part, it was primarily comprised of a C# file, with the web part not having a designer interface, of course, and then the web part .webpart file, which defined some of the metadata and properties that were required by SharePoint to make it aware of the web part and what was involved with it. And of course our C# file, nothing interesting, but we'll come back to it in a second actually. The elements XML file determines how the thing's deployed as well. Just close our feature. So with the visual web part, we basically have sort of a container for not only those elements that we're used to, but also a user control. And that user control is, there's nothing fancy about it, it's user control. It's got some SharePoint-y awareness that a user control might not have otherwise. But apart from that, it's pretty much a stock standard user control with a declarative front end and a code-based back end. Code behind files, so nothing too exciting. But where these two, where our C# web part comes together with our user control is in the create child controls method. Up the top here you can see we've got a private variable declared, which tells our web part where to find the ASCX file, or in other words, the user control. So that user control is going to be deployed into the control templates folder, again under a project-specific folder, and also under a folder to package up all of the visual web part bits and pieces. So when create child controls runs, it's going to use the load control method on the page object, on the page class, to load that control by name and add it to the controls collection. So there's really sort of not a whole lot of smoke and mirrors going on here under the covers. Effectively, we have a designer that we can make use of if we want to, or we can use the declarative approach instead of having to define all this stuff in all of the child controls in the C# file, as we would have had to do previously. And all that's happening is that the web part file is loading the control for us. So this can actually be achieved right now within SharePoint 2007. It's a technique that I've been using for some time, and it's actually the technique, or my understanding is anyway, it's the same technique that the Sun Smart part uses to load the user control that it's pointed at. So, I mean, this is not a SharePoint method, the load control method. It's not. It's a member of the page type, so there's nothing specific to SharePoint happening here. And the only issue that you might face, I suppose, is handing off any or retrieving any public properties that you declare in the web part itself that are exposed as sort of interface type things within a tool part. And handing that data off to your user control, or supplying data from the user control, modified in the user control, back to the web part itself. So that can either be achieved using public properties. You have an instance of your control here, and you can actually cast that instance to a specific type if need be, so you can access the public properties of that type. And in the same way, you can use a data transfer object to package up all of your data instead of exposing multiple properties. So that's not done for you by Visual Studio, but should you need to do it, you can figure out what your type name is and come back to your C# file here and do a little bit of casting. Visual Web Part 1 user control, I think it was, yeah. And of course, do some of that. So now I can go control dot whatever. I can access all of my child controls within it if I need to pull stuff out of out of its child controls, and any public properties that I expose within this class. My prop will also be exposed. No, I don't want that. No, I don't want that. That's probably, what do I call it, my prop. So, pretty nice and easy. Just get rid of that now, so this thing compiles in a second. So the visual part's pretty nice. It's easy to work, a lot easier to work with, in my opinion, unless you really like doing dealing with child controls and that sort of thing in C#, and I don't. So next up, let's have a look at some link to SharePoint stuff, and we'll come back to the debugging stuff. If only so I can save a bit of time instead of having to wait around waiting for stuff to deploy in a rather slow VM. So let's see. I'm going to drop into my C# file here and just collapse some of this stuff. So link to SQL is link to SharePoint. Apologies if I've been saying link to SQL all this time. Is pretty much everything it promises to be. It's a link provider for all of the SharePoint stuff all the SharePoint lists that we want to be working with. And effectively, it's a query language that Link generally is a query language that's built into our languages of choice, such as C# or VB.NET. Apart from the sort of nice things like IntelliSense that it provides us with, we get the benefits of working with strong types and compile time checking. So compare that with having to work with string-based field names when retrieving list data using camel queries, or sort of iterating through a list. Link does a lot of what it does using compiler-generated types, which are generally anonymous types, which makes life easy for us, basically, as developers. Dropping the var keyword and stuff's coming back to us. It's still strongly typed. We can still use IntelliSense against it, but the compiler is inferring the type at compile time instead of adding a lot of forcing us as developers to add a lot of extra verbosity to our code. So it's notable that link to SharePoint is primarily going to be used for accessing list data. Under the covers, it is actually generating camel code, and there's a log method on the data context class, I believe it is, that will allow you to see exactly the camel that's being generated, and it does some. I mean, it will generate some pretty funky camel for you. So if you're still interested in camel, it might be worth having a look at it. So in short, linked SharePoint is an alternative to SPQuery, but it doesn't replace camel more broadly within SharePoint. So within the SharePoint root and the bin directory, you'll find a little console application called SPMetal. Now, SPMetal is to link to SharePoint what SQLmetal is to link to SQL. Effectively, it's a utility that will generate a data context class for you. So if I pop back just to my bin folder for a second and bring a command window, SPMetal, we can have a look at some of the options that are available to us when using this utility. It's pretty straightforward to use. Unfortunately, Visual Studio does not provide us with a designer for these for our data context classes in the same way that Link to SQL does. But the community toolkit once again comes to the rescue, and apparently it's got a designer included with it. So it's definitely worth having a look at that extension. So the bare minimum that we need to get this thing running essentially is the URL to our web and the name of the code file that we want to generate. Apart from that, there are a couple of other bits and pieces here. So if we don't specify a language, the language parameter, the language of the file, the generated file will use the language based on the extension of the code file that we're creating. So if we're creating a .cs file, we'll end up with a C# file. According to these parameters, I haven't tried it yet, but according to these parameters, we can also run this thing against a remote SharePoint install and provide username and password as required. In terms of the code generation, again, you'll probably want to be providing the namespace that you want your code to be using. And additionally, we can specify an XML-based parameters file, which we'll have a look at in a second, to further refine the code file that comes at the other end. And it's worth having a look at this stuff because it allows you some extra control. I'll just start up. Actually, no, I won't. So essentially what we get at the other end from this tool is here's a data context class, and that data context class is essentially a proxy class for our list, for our SharePoint list. So if I wanted to run this thing, I won't run it right now, but if I wanted to run it pointing at my internet site, I'll show you the command that you can use to run it. I've got an example that I wrote earlier hanging around here somewhere. Sorry, that actually ran for the user group the other night. I'll just wait for this to open up a second. For the single reason that I've got an SPMetal folder in here that I've created already, and the entities class is sitting here already as well. So don't want to spoil the excitement. Just close some of this stuff. The command that I've run for this is SPMetal, passing in the name of the web as I mentioned, which in this case is internet.contosa.com, my site that I've got running here. The name of the code file that I want generated for me and the location where it's going to end up, so just dumping it into the root of the C drive, and then the parameters XML file that I want as well. So let's have a look at that next. Essentially it's pretty straightforward. It's basically just a configuration file. By default, SPMetal is going to proxy all of the lists in the web that I point it to. Now I don't always want that to happen. So in this case I'm using the out-of-the-box links list, and that's the only list that I want back. So I've told it that I want the links list, and the member name that I want to be using for it is named links. I've also told it to exclude all other lists. Up here on the web element itself, I specify that I want the class name that's generated to be called entities, and if I want to, I can change the access modifier from public to something, let's say, like internal. I haven't actually tried that, but conceivably that would get me there. So when I run that, what I'm going to get at the other end is my entities.cs class. So if we pop this in here, we can see that in our single file we've got a couple classes here basically. Primarily the entities class, which is the name that I've given it, so that's an arbitrary name, and importantly it inherits from the Microsoft.SharePoint.link.dataContext class, in the same way that that many of your data context classes for link to SQL will inherit from the SQL data context class. Looking a little bit further down in here, we've got a public property named links, which is the member that we specified in the parameters file, and it returns for me an entity list of type of links, and importantly it's decorated with this list attribute, which tells which tells the data context which list it should be using within SharePoint. If I hop down here to the link class itself, I can see that the class has been decorated with the content type attribute, which specifies the content type on which this link object is based, or the link class definition is based. So I specified the ID has been specified for me, and the name as well. Scrolling down a little bit further, we start to find properties mapped to our list fields that look quite familiar. So for instance, we've got our URL fields and our comment fields. And again, we've got a column attribute to map that particular property back to the individual column, and the internal name and all that sort of stuff. Interestingly, when we work with these properties, the data itself is getting stored into private fields, and we'll have a look at the two-way connectivity that's going on here. But between the two-way connectivity between our linked SQL linked SharePoint code and SharePoint itself. Essentially, any changes that we make are going to be persisted into SharePoint only when we tell the code to do just that. In the interim, the stuff's going to be stored in memory in private fields. And I think that's everything I wanted to show you in the entities class. Let's just double check that. A couple of notes, I guess. If you have any lists that are hooked up to lookups or related to other SharePoint lists, those are all supported by SPWebCast. So you'll find an association attribute, and effectively you can then do cross-list queries within Link. So that's pretty neat. Of course, anytime your list schema itself changes, you'll need to regenerate this class, so it's worthwhile probably not going too overboard with this thing or inheriting from it if need be. And all this linked to SharePoint stuff's only available to us server side. If we want to be doing this stuff client side, we need to be using the SPRest interface. And the entities class that comes at the other end, of course, needs to be added to the solution. So back in our blank project, let's start using this thing now, this entities class that we've created. So I'll just add it to this project so we can deploy. Grab that, drop that in there. Unfortunately, this isn't automated. Refresh that, and add this to the project. So we can now use our entities class. One other thing we need to do is add a reference to Microsoft.SharePoint.link.SQL. So once that finishes loading, we can scroll down here to hopefully find it somewhere. There it is, Microsoft.SharePoint.link. Pop that in there. And add a couple of using statements as well for the same thing. Link and system.link as well. This is actually required if it's not included. The project won't compile. So the next thing we want to do is start typing out some link queries. Before we really start doing that, though, let's instantiate our entities class. The first thing I'm going to do is pop in a using statement here for my entities context. My the entities class that we created earlier. And hopefully that'll come up. And what I need to provide to it is the URL to the web that contains the list that I want to query. So since I've generated this from the root, I'm going to do a little bit of a cheat and just grab the URL of the current web in SP context. And I think I'm missing a reference to Microsoft.SharePoint as well. There we go. Alright. So why am I dropping this into a using statement? Well, because the entity missing a bracket. The entities context, the underlying type implements are disposable, and as a result we have a dispose method here. And generally any object that you instantiate that exposes a dispose member should be called by you. So just to avoid any memory leaks, that's the approach we're going to take tonight. So we're going to do two things. We're going to start with just a straight query, and then we'll look at some update stuff as well. So starting with our query, I want to define a new variable to contain the results of my query itself, and I'm going to call that links because I'm querying the links list that's provided to me out of the box by SharePoint. So I want my data from my entities context class, and specifically the links property that we looked at earlier. So dealing with that individual link, let's have a look at, I'm assuming that you're roughly familiar with link in general, but just for the sake of argument, let's order this thing by the URL of the link that we're getting back. And then we'll project all of that into a new anonymous type and define within it three properties. First is our URL. I'm going to pull that directly out of URL. By the way, I'm not a super duper link developer just yet, having been mired in C# or .NET 3.0 for quite some time. So there's probably better ways of doing this, but this will get us running anyway tonight. The second field I want to grab is the comments field, and the third field that I want to offer up is something I'm calling display string, which doesn't exist on my underlying link object, but I'm going to create it based from some of the values themselves. So the URL plus we're concatenating the comments just for display purposes, essentially. Link.comments, and that's that. So that's not enough to actually run this thing. The link queries aren't called until you actually use them. So at the moment, my links variable is null. So to get some data in there, let's start using it. And to do that, we're going to enumerate. This query is going to return for us an object of type IEnumerable. So that means I can use it in a for each loop. And all I'm going to do is display the content. So to do that, let's drop into our visual web part here, my markup, and I'm just going to add a literal to contain the output. So call that literal1 dot text, and we'll dump into there our display string since that's why it exists. And just to be safe, we'll add some breakage as well. So that's basically it. At this point, we've got a query. it's pulling data from our links list, and we're able to interact with it. So that's part one. I'll run this in a second. But first up, I want to define a second little region called update, and explore with you some of the ways that we can write back to our list. So again, I'm going to define a variable to hold my query. And the reason I want to select a specific link, I don't want to update all of my links. So instead of reusing the previous query, I'll just create a new one here. Entities context links. And I'm going to add to this query a filter so that I can only include links with a URL that's link with a URL that starts with http www.google.com.au .com, and from there I'll grab the link itself instead of creating a new more detailed type. Again, because I'm retrieving a nine-interval thing and nothing more specific, we'll for each this again, just as we did before, into from our links to update object. And using our link dot comments field. So this is the member that we looked at earlier. I now want to add to it the current date time, or the current time. So I go down dot to short time string. That'll do to demonstrate the fact that we're updating. So we'll see it before, basically, update it, and see it after. So let's see if that builds quickly before we try to deploy it. And I've missed something basic. As always good to build first before we try to deploy anything to SharePoint. It just takes too long to deploy to SharePoint. So that's that. We're ready to deploy. So let's have a look at some of the debugging bits now as well. Let's set a breakpoint here, and hopefully this is going to hang together. I'm going to hit F5 now, and down in the bottom left-hand side of the screen we're going to see that we're building, nothing new there. But then we're going through some of these deployment steps that we looked at earlier. So we're deploying the solutions being added. We've reset IIS. Activating the features. The deploy's been successful. So what's going to happen next? Visual Studio is going to launch a new instance of IE with a start URL, and we'll have our SharePoint set up, and with a debugger actually attached to it. So of course, in the past, we would have had to drop into the debug menu, hit attach to process, find the process running on the machine. As I mentioned, I'd do all of my development remotely. Just get rid of this. So that would mean sort of ensuring that the remote debugger was running. And then, of course, when you get down into this dialog, you'll find that there's 500,000 W3W processes running, so you can attach to them all if you want to, or locate the one by ID and IS, and it goes on and on and on. So we don't have to do any of that anymore. SharePoint's doing it all for us. Visual Studio, I apologize, is doing it all for us. And we'll just wait for that to load quickly. What else have we got in terms of debugging to look at? Basically, I hit F5, so the debug experience is pretty much just as we have always wanted it to be. While that's loading, we'll have a look at what's been generated for us in the file system. So we've got this PKG file folder here, which is mapped to our project basically, and these are all the bits that then eventually end up in our cab file or our WISP file. So of course the manifest file itself, and our feature bits, and our web part bits. Nothing too unexpected there. Our control template, which is the use control. So that's kind of boring. Probably won't be touching this too much, and just leave the system to sort that out for you. But in the bin folder, we've now got a WISP file, and of course, just as before, if we rename that to cab, we can now dive into it and see exactly what's being sent to SharePoint. So all the bits that we wanted, and I won't bother extracting that, but all the files as we specified them, so it's pretty nice. So, and our page is still loading, of course. So I'll take this opportunity to mention that because we're running on the local environment, our debug symbols are being dumped somewhere. I'm not sure where exactly. If you're building a cab file and you wanted to include your debug symbols within that cab file, they're not there by default. Best practice for getting them in there, I'm not sure what that will be yet, but it would seem that you can add the PDB file to the package through the Advanced tab, where you would normally add another assembly. I attempted to do that and add it to the GAC. It didn't succeed, so I'm not sure if I'd have any more success adding to the bin. But surely there's got to be some way to deploy PDB files. And of course, we're back in action now, so let's edit this page, and we'll locate our web part, and add it to the page, and if we're lucky, I can see our breakpoints live over here, so hopefully the debugger will break for us, and everything won't just explode. So eventually, maybe, if I didn't jump the gun, we'd have an edit page. I've just hit the save button again, so bear with me. Let's go over to the insert tab here and see if we can preempt this. And we'll wait for our web part icon to come to life. No, we won't. Apologies. Start again. And we'll wait for our web part icon to come to life. There we go. And I think this web part's going to live in custom, and there it is. So we'll select that, add it to the top of our page. It's so nice not having to think about web part zones and this wiki stuff anymore. And we'll let SharePoint do its thinking as it needs to do. It's a very thoughtful application, isn't it? Unless, of course, I've written some dodgy code and it's crashing. Let's see if we can pop back here for a second. While we're waiting for that, let's have a look at, and that's broken, but let's have a look at the SharePoint Explorer. SharePoint Explorer is in many ways very similar to what you guys might be used to with SharePoint Manager 2007. Essentially, it's a view of the SharePoint content database, I guess, and the farm. Primarily the content base, I think, if memory content database, if memory serves. Yeah, and all the features and list bits and content types and all the things that we're deploying, essentially. So this stuff's read-only. We do get some properties that we can look at. So we can drill down into it. It's not. It's definitely not SharePoint Manager, and SharePoint Manager 2010 is all ready to go. So it's just an external tool, of course. But we can explore these things in the property sheet as well if need be. And this thing is extensible, so no doubt someone will come along and make it read-write at some point in the future. I believe Waldeck, again, conceivably has already got some extensions here to display possibly page layouts and that sort of thing. If I could be wrong. And so we'll just close that down and get back to our debug session here. So let's just let that run because it's obviously holding up the page. And we'll come back to that. Okay, so our first query statement here. Let's see if we can step into this. Yes, we missed it. Let's keep going anyway. See if we can catch the update. Run to cursor. So where I wanted to be was in here, basically. So we can see at the moment that the comments on this URL is what more can you ask for? Of course, it's the Google URL. So I'm now going to append the current time to it. And we'll step over that, and of course it updates. Nothing exciting there, that's only updated the private field. One thing I actually forgot to add here, this isn't actually going to work, apologies. I apologize for that. I'll just pop back here for a second and show you the code that I wrote earlier instead of trying to redeploy this. There is, down below, submit changes command that we need to, method that we need to call to actually have this persisted back to SharePoint. So unfortunately that's not going to happen in our case, but if I let this run again, we can see that our web part has selected some stuff. Actually, if we have a look at that list, sorry, there are actually a couple of other URLs in there. So I've missed something, obviously, in my hastily written demo code, but we've got the single item up there at least. So just to prove to you and to prove to myself that there is other content in this list. Yeah, so these are what we're trying to retrieve. Let's see if we can figure out why that's not happening. What is my code doing? And there's no filtering going on there or anything, so it should be returning everything. Maybe I've lost my web part. Let's add it back. Probably forgot to save the page. No, it was there all along. So, not sure what's happened to the rest of it, but you can see anyway that we are retrieving data from our SharePoint list, and it's not quite successful, but it does should give you the gist of it anyway. So with that, let's have a very quick look at some considerations for yes, I do. For console applications. Eventually. So if I create a new project here, create a new straightforward console application, of course you could argue that a lot of this stuff should probably be done using PowerShell, or maybe you've got alternative means for doing it. But a lot of the time, when you need to hand off some sort of custom-built bulk utility to an admin, the best way to do it's going to be a console application. Your admin can just click the exe and away it goes. A lot of the time, though, Visual Studio is going to default this to version 4 of the framework. So the first thing you need to do is change that back to 3.5, or you're going to come across some errors. So that's easy, of course. Relatively straightforward. Something that's a little bit less obvious, of course, and I'll just let this finish loading up, is the fact that SharePoint 2010 is running as a 64-bit environment. And by default, if we have a look at the properties page and the build tab, we can see that, that Visual Studio has created for us a 32-bit application. And if you try and run this, you're going to get a runtime error. So by default, you need to come in here and change this to either any CPU or x64, and then you're good. And with that, that concludes this demo. Thanks very much. And that wraps up the demos for this presentation. In the slide deck, I've got some links here for some of the tools that I've mentioned, mainly the extensions to Visual Studio that are definitely worth looking at. In particular, the Community Kit for SharePoint. And if you're a general Visual Studio user, highly recommend that you have a look at the VS 2010 Power Commands. Scott Guthrie's got a good blog post on this stuff on his blog if you're interested. And apart from that, I'd like to thank you very much for your interest in this presentation, and I'll see you next time.
Okay, thanks very much for taking the time to view this webcast. Please bear in mind that you can subscribe to an iTunes or an RSS feed to be able to pick these things up more frequently. I encourage you to check back on the SharePoint Dev Wiki because I will be doing a lot more of these in the future.